There is a green door in Kensington, London, that has never stopped collecting secrets. It sits at 1 Logan Place, half hidden behind brick walls tall enough to make the outside world feel like a rumor, and for decades it has drawn people from every corner of the planet, not because of what lies beyond it in any architectural sense, but because of what that door represents. A threshold, a boundary between the Freddie Mercury the world thought it knew and the Freddie Mercury that almost nobody ever actually saw. Journalists spent years trying to get past it. Photographers camped outside it for months. Fans still travel thousands of miles just to stand in front of it and press their palms against the paint. And yet for all of that, the question that has quietly haunted everyone who ever stood at that door remains exactly the same. What was really in there? Not the furniture, not the art collection, not the grand piano or the Japanese garden or the mirrored dressing room. What was really in there? Because the people who finally walked through it after Freddie died on November 24, 1991, didn't come out talking about architecture. They came out changed. They came out saying the same thing, quietly, almost reluctantly, as though the admission cost them something. That they had known Freddie Mercury for years, in some cases for decades, and that what they found inside that house made them realize they had never known him at all. That is where this story begins. Not with his voice, not with the stadiums, not with the sequins or the mustache or the impossible notes. It begins with a green door, and with everything that was waiting behind it. To understand what made the discovery inside Garden Lodge so disorienting, you have to first reckon with how deliberately Freddie Mercury had constructed the version of himself that the world was allowed to see. From the very beginning, he understood instinctively that the gap between public and private was not just a matter of personal preference. It was a survival mechanism. He had learned that lesson long before he was famous, back when he was still Farrokh Bulsara, a Parsi boy born on September 5, 1946, in Stonetown, Zanzibar, to parents who had carried their Zoroastrian traditions across continents and planted them quietly in foreign soil. His father Bomi worked at the British colonial courthouse. His mother kept a home that was orderly, warm, and deeply private. When Freddie was sent to St. Peter's boarding school near Bombay at the age of 8, he entered a world of rules, schedules, and social hierarchies that rewarded conformity. He did not conform. He formed a band called the Hectics, taught himself to replay any song he heard on the radio note for note on the school piano, and began, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, calling himself Freddie. The name felt truer than the one he had been given, and truth was always something Freddie pursued on his own terms, in his own time, at a distance carefully chosen to protect himself. When the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964 forced his family to flee their home with almost nothing, that instinct for self-protection deepened into something more deliberate. England received them without ceremony. Feltham, Middlesex, gray and cold and entirely indifferent, became the backdrop against which Freddie began constructing himself in earnest. Art school at Ealing, a diploma in graphic design, a market stall in Kensington where he sold vintage clothing alongside a drummer named Roger Taylor, a baggage handling job at Heathrow Airport where he carried other people's luggage while quietly accumulating the weight of his own ambitions. Nobody watching him then could have identified what was being assembled. That was, of course, entirely by design. By 1970, the assembly was nearly complete. Freddie had joined forces with Brian May and Roger Taylor, renamed their band Queen over universal skepticism, legally shed the name Bulsara, and become Mercury, a name chosen with the precision of someone who understood that identity is its own kind of art form. Mercury, the element that moves like liquid but cannot be held in a bare hand. Mercury, the planetary body closest to the sun, defined by its proximity to an intensity that would destroy anything less resilient. Before Queen had a record deal, Freddie had already designed their crest by hand, a heraldic coat of arms so detailed and so deliberately royal in its symbolism that it looked like it had been commissioned by an actual monarchy. His vocal range, stretched across 4 octaves and shaped in part by 4 extra incisors that had modified his oral resonance since birth, gave Queen a sound that no producer could have engineered artificially. But it was the songwriting that revealed what was truly happening inside Freddie Mercury's mind. Bohemian Rhapsody, constructed without a conventional chorus, built across multiple genre shifts, 6 minutes long in an era when radio programmers demanded 3, was not an accident or an experiment. It was a statement. It said, in musical language more clearly than Freddie would say in almost any interview, that there were things happening inside him that could not be compressed into acceptable formats or comfortable categories. The song was released in 1975 and spent 9 weeks at #1 in the United Kingdom. Decades later, it would become the most streamed song of the 20th century on Spotify. The record executives who called it commercial suicide never quite recovered from being that wrong. Freddie, characteristically, never mentioned it. What Freddie did instead was perform. And what performing meant to Freddie Mercury was something categorically different from what it meant to anyone else who had ever stood on a stage. When he walked out in front of 72,000 people at Wembley Stadium on July 13, 1985, for the Live Aid concert, he was wearing jeans and a plain white tank top. No costume, no theatrical entrance, no elaborate production design. Just the man, the microphone, and 20 minutes that critics, musicians, and broadcasters would spend the next 4 decades arguing was the single greatest live performance in the history of popular music. He improvised a vocal call-in response with the crowd that had no rehearsal behind it, led entirely by instinct and by a quality of human connection that cannot be taught or manufactured or replicated. Brian May said he could reach the last person at the back of the furthest stand. David Bowie said he took things over the edge in a way nobody else had managed. But what neither of them could fully explain, and what footage of the performance still fails to completely capture, is the quality of presence that Freddie brought to that stage. The sense that every single one of those 72,000 people was being seen individually, that the performance was somehow both massive in scale and completely intimate in feeling. Queen's final concert at Knebworth Park in August 1986 drew nearly 200,000 people, and Freddie closed it in a golden robe and a replica crown raised above his head, every gesture calibrated for a crowd the size of a small city. A week before that show, he had told Brian May quietly that he probably wouldn't be doing this much longer. Nobody asked him to elaborate. The unspoken things between Freddie Mercury and the people he loved always carried more weight than anything said out loud. And it was the unspoken things that Garden Lodge was built to protect. The house at 1 Logan Place was purchased in 1980, at the peak of Queen's commercial dominance, for £500,000. What Freddie did to it over the following years was not decoration. It was excavation. He was digging down into himself and building upward from what he found there, creating a physical space that reflected the interior life he had spent his entire career concealing from the public. He designed the Japanese garden himself, overseeing the placement of every magnolia tree, every sculpted topiary, every water feature that created the constant soft background of moving water that filtered through the music room and the bar where he entertained his closest friends. In Kensington, where outdoor space was almost mythologically scarce, Freddie had constructed an oasis of deliberate calm that bore no resemblance to any image the tabloids had ever printed of him. The drawing room stretched through 2 full floors, its ceilings high and its walls dressed in a warm saffron yellow that people who walked into it for the first time consistently described as the closest a room could come to radiating light of its own. The piano at its center was not decorative. It had been played extensively and regularly, not for audiences but for Freddie himself, in the hours when the house was quiet and the outside world had temporarily stopped demanding things from him. The mirrored dressing room upstairs, where he had prepared himself for the transformation from private person to public force hundreds of times, was organized with a neatness that startled people who expected chaos. His trainers were lined up. His costumes were stored with care. Everything had a place, which was remarkable for a man whose stage persona suggested someone who had never given a moment's thought to order. But the stage persona was always the construction. The man inside the house was something else entirely. He collected Japanese art with the focused attention of a scholar. He doted on his cats with an openness of affection that he rarely extended toward human beings he didn't completely trust. He would telephone home from tours on different continents specifically to have someone hold the phone receiver up to a cat's ear, because he wanted them to hear his voice and because he missed them in a way that was completely unperformative and completely real. His favorite, Delilah, had a song named after her. The cats were, in the private language of Garden Lodge, as much a part of the household as any person. The people Freddie actually trusted, the handful who moved through Garden Lodge as though it were their own home, understood something about him that the rest of the world spent decades missing entirely. He was not complicated because he was damaged or dishonest. He was complicated because he was genuinely multiple things simultaneously, and most of those things had been learned to survive in a world that consistently demanded simplification. Mary Austin had understood this from the beginning. She had met Freddie in 1969 when she was 19 and working at the Biba Boutique in Kensington, and what developed between them was one of the most unusual and enduring bonds in rock history. They were romantically involved for several years. Freddie proposed to her. She accepted. And then, in a conversation that Mary described as one of the most difficult of her life, Freddie told her the truth about his attraction to men. Mary told him flatly, and with the directness that characterized everything about her, that he was gay. Their romantic relationship ended in that conversation. Their bond did not. She worked for his management. She traveled with Queen on tours. She was present at Garden Lodge in the years when his health was failing and the circle around him was contracting to almost nothing. When Freddie died, he left her the house and half his fortune. He called her his common-law wife, and the description, however legally informal, captured something that no legal category had adequate language for. Mary became the keeper of his ashes, a responsibility she has honored with a discretion that exactly mirrors the discretion with which he lived. Jim Hutton, the Irish hairdresser Freddie had met in a London nightclub in 1985, occupied the other central position in Freddie's private life. They wore matching gold rings at Garden Lodge. Freddie called him his husband. Jim was present through the years of illness, through the progressive physical decline that Freddie managed with a self-discipline that people who witnessed it found almost incomprehensible, and he was there at the end, on the afternoon of November 24, 1991, when Freddie's body finally surrendered to the bronchial pneumonia that AIDS had made impossible to fight. Jim Hutton died in 2010, 19 years later, from lung cancer at the age of 60. He had never, in all those years, stopped wearing the ring. The illness itself was a story Freddie controlled with the same absolute authority he brought to every other aspect of his public image, which is to say he controlled it completely until the moment he chose to release it. He had received his HIV diagnosis in 1987, the same year that Paul Printer, his former personal assistant, and one of the small number of people who had been permitted genuine access to his private life, sold intimate details about Freddie to a British tabloid. The Printer betrayal was the most significant breach in the walls Freddie had spent his career building. Printer was himself living with HIV at the time of the sale, according to his family, financially desperate and convinced that the years of loyalty he had given Mercury had been discarded without adequate recognition. The tabloid payment was framed as an act of desperation. For Freddie and those around him, it was something considerably harder to absorb. After Printer, the circle at Garden Lodge became smaller and more deliberate than it had ever been. Freddie told Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon only that he could no longer tour. They accepted this without pressing further. Years later, May described it as an unspoken agreement, a friendship deep enough to hold a silence of that magnitude without cracking. At a private dinner in Montreux in 1989, Freddie finally confirmed what they had been quietly reckoning with for years. He kept it brief. "Business as usual," he said. "Keep making music." They did. The recordings Freddie made in those final years, his voice increasingly raw, increasingly exposed, formed some of the most emotionally powerful material in Queen's catalog. He was in the studio whenever his body permitted it, recording with a concentration and a commitment that people who were present for those sessions have never been able to describe without their voices changing. He was not being brave in any performed sense. He was simply doing the one thing that had always felt most like himself, and he was determined to keep doing it for as long as he physically could. On November 23, 1991, his publicist released a statement Freddie had written from his bed at Garden Lodge. He confirmed his HIV status. He confirmed AIDS. He asked the public to join him in the fight against the disease. And then, having maintained complete control of his own narrative for as long as it had been necessary, he let it go. He died the following afternoon. He was 45 years old. What came after his death unfolded slowly, in the way that things do when a life of that size and complexity needs time to be properly understood. Garden Lodge stood largely undisturbed for decades, Mary Austin moving through it as though maintaining a living space rather than a memorial, tending the Japanese garden with the same care Freddie had insisted upon, keeping the piano in its place in the saffron yellow drawing room, preserving the mirrored dressing room exactly as he had left it. The green door outside accumulated its own separate history, layer by layer, year by year, as fans arrived from every part of the world to leave something behind. Love letters, thank you notes, poems written by teenagers who had discovered Queen long after Freddie died and felt, inexplicably and undeniably, that they owed him something personal. Photographs, messages in dozens of languages. The surface of that door became a document of what Freddie Mercury had meant to people who had never met him and never would, which was itself a kind of revelation about the nature of the connection he had forged through his music. When Mary eventually decided to sell both the house and a selection of Freddie's personal possessions, the auction that followed at Sotheby's became one of the most emotionally charged sales in the institution's history. More than 1,500 items went under the hammer. The velvet robe and replica crown from the 1986 Magic Tour, stage costumes, handwritten lyric sheets, personal photographs, furniture and objects from inside Garden Lodge that fans had never previously seen. The green front door itself, covered in its accumulated decades of tribute, sold for £412,000. The number landed with a particular kind of force because it was almost exactly what Freddie had paid for the entire property in 1980. By 2024, the house was listed at over £30 million. The distance between those two figures is its own kind of measure of what his life had been worth, not in any spiritual or artistic sense, but in the cold and unsentimental language of the market, which is the only language that never lies and never flatters. Mary said, when she spoke publicly about the sale, that she hoped whoever came next would feel inside that house what she had always felt. Not celebrity, not history, not the weight of cultural significance. Something quieter. The sense of being in a place that had been genuinely loved by someone who understood, with complete and hard-won clarity, exactly what love cost and exactly what it was worth. And that, perhaps, is the thing about Garden Lodge that no auction price and no architectural description can fully capture. It was not built to be seen. It was not designed for the cameras or the biographers or the fans pressing their hands against the green door. It was built for the moments between performances, for the hours when the lights were off and the crowds were gone and there was nobody left to perform for. It was built for the version of Freddie Mercury that existed when he was simply, quietly, entirely himself. And it is that version, the one the world caught only glimpses of, the one his closest friends saw clearly only after he was gone, that Garden Lodge holds still. Every room a record, every carefully chosen object a lyric. Every inch of that Japanese garden a note held longer than anyone thought possible, blooming in the silence after the last show, outlasting everything except the music itself.